Thank you, Allison, for inviting me, and Whitney for everything. So while we get the clicker, I'll run through the format for our conversation before we get started. So we'll have brief presentations, about 10 minutes from Allison and myself. We'll cover specific projects, exhibitions, research, our relationships to the American South, and how they connect us to the global South. After that, we'll have an open conversation between Allison and I. We'll ask each other questions and expand more on our approach. And so this is really meant to be a dialogue and about dialogue and exchange. So during the Q&A, we encourage you to join the conversation and share any ideas, comments, or questions that come to mind during our presentations.
Great.
Conversation. Yeah.
So I think I'll take it away.
Take it away.
My name is Allison Glenn, and I'm the Associate Curator of Contemporary Art at Crystal Bridges. Crystal Bridges is a major American art museum in Bentonville, Arkansas. We have been open for 7 years, so a really young institution. I've been in my current role for a little over a year. At the museum, I think a lot about living artists and working with living artists. So for the past year, I've been working on the residency pilot program. I also curate exhibitions in our North Forest. And I don't know if anyone here has been to Crystal Bridges. If you have, will you raise your hand?
Oh,
Great.
wow.
Oh,
yeah.
Nice. So about half the audience. So as you know, we're situated in a 120-acre forest, and we're actually in a ravine. And we have 3 kind of key pillars. It's art, architecture, and nature. And I have the wonderful opportunity to be the curator of public sculpture there. So right now I'm thinking a lot about the North Forest, which is about a 33-acre trail in our larger 120-acre art trail system. And I also curate exhibitions within the galleries. But I thought I would start thinking a lot about land. Land is something that is really important to me, maps in particular, cartographies, embodied experiences. And as we're talking about the South as site in this conversation, I thought it'd be appropriate to mention that, as you can probably guess, I wasn't born and raised in the South. So I have been working in the South since 2016, so just really about 3 years. Since I've started working and thinking about the South, I have lived in the area that is part of the Louisiana Purchase. And so I'm often thinking about this large swath of land which was acquired from the French in 1804, and kind of working through frameworks that think a lot about this and the global South and larger conversations around that. And most of us are very familiar with the fact that the Louisiana Purchase was a forced sale. Napoleon actually had to sell this big part of the land that it's basically entire states of Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma have been carved out of this large swath of land in the center of the country. It's also important to note that this land was inhabited by indigenous populations before colonial settlers came. Really, the acquisition of this part of the country fueled a lot of ideas around manifest destiny. But also importantly, the reason why Napoleon had to sell this portion of France's holdings is because they lost their wealthiest colony, which was Haiti, in 1803 at the end of the Haitian fight for independence. And really the development of New Orleans and the development of Louisiana as part of the United States was fueled by the Haitian independence movement. So a lot of this goes into the way that I think about my relationship to the South, because there's many parts of the South, and in this particular region, it feels like an appropriate place to begin this conversation. So specifically New Orleans. So I began visiting New Orleans around 8 years after Hurricane Katrina's devastation, on the occasion of Prospect 3 Notes for Now that was curated by Franklin Sermons. Franklin invited me to write about the work of 2 Chicago-based artists. At the time I was living and working in Chicago. One of them is Theaster Gates and the other is MacArthur Binion. And at the time, as I mentioned, I was living in Chicago. I visited New Orleans for the first time, not before Katrina. So, it's a very different experience pre and post, and something that's important to note. But when I got there, I just felt like I was home. And there's no real words to describe it other than the fact that I felt visible, I felt seen and heard, and also very outside of my comfort zone. And what's really interesting is that the South as an idea, the South as a site, is something that wasn't a reality in my mind before visiting. I didn't think about the South in the ways I think about the South now. But so, pretty soon after that, I quit my job as the director of a commercial gallery and did the crazy thing of moving to New Orleans to join the team for Prospect 4. And so my role was a dual one. I was the manager of publications and curatorial associate. And so as the manager of publications, one of my first responsibilities was the catalog. And the interesting thing about biennials is that, you're building the catalog without knowing what about a fourth of the exhibition is going to look like, because there's so many artists that are responding to the site. And so I was shaping this document that would live on as the archive long after the exhibition was over. So themes started to emerge. I began to think about the arrival, specifically my arrival, to the city and to the South. And as I mentioned, before I arrived, the South was an idea, a concept. It was a place my relatives left for promises of better wages, better living conditions, and promises of a better life. I'm the result of the Great Migration. I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, and my grandmother moved up from nearby where we are now, actually. So this idea of returning would destabilize the exodus, and yet I was curious. So I played this idea of the arrival out in an introductory essay for the catalog, and I'm going to read a brief excerpt from this. The essay is called Multidimensional Cartographies. In 2009, toward the end of his life, Edouard Glissant set sail aboard the Queen Mary from the United Kingdom to the United States. He was accompanied by the Malian filmmaker Manthia Diawara, who used some of the footage he shot during the crossing to create Edouard Glissant, One World in Relation, a film about Glissant's theory of relation. During the transatlantic journey, their conversation foregrounded the idea of the arrival, or the moment where all components of humanity consent to the idea that it's possible to be one and multiple at the same time. Appropriately broached on a vessel in the water, this idea existed in both physical and conceptual space via the brilliant symbolism of the ship as a motif and the sea as a site through which to navigate. In some of the same ways, Prospect New Orleans seeks to create multidimensional cartographies, crafting an experience of the New Orleans landscape through contemporary art so as to elicit social critique and promote community building. The Atlantic plays a key role in artistic director Trevor Schoonmaker's curatorial framework for this fourth iteration, Prospect 4, The Lotus in Spite of the Swamp. The impact of colonialism on the city over the 300 years of its history is so appropriately central to the themes espoused by Schoonmaker and the participating artists. Throughout the exhibition, we see the boat as a motif, water as a site, whether ocean, gulf, or river, and New Orleans as a labyrinthine landscape through which artists and collectives move. Themes materialize around the cultural connections between New Orleans and the global South, and through the development of local traditions with roots in hybrid forms. Within this carefully considered conceptual framework, Schoonmaker positions the city at the convergence of culture and history, and within a larger discourse of transnationalism and postcolonialism. So that kind of set the framework through which people were experiencing Prospect. And then I just want to talk a little bit about living in New Orleans. So in New Orleans, I lived in the 7th Ward, and this is really important. You know, there's a lot of personal history that's going into this conversation I'm telling you today, because I really think that that's part of my my curatorial practice is really deeply steeped in relationships with artists, relationships with land. And so I lived at the 7th Ward neighborhood, and Willie Birch was my landlord. He's a New Orleans-based artist. He was in Prospect 1. And it's great to note that when I arrived in at Crystal Bridges to assume my current role, this work of his was on view in the galleries. And it's a drawing that he made of domino players in the 7th Ward, the neighborhood I lived in. And so I really saw that as a kind of lovely indicator of coming home, or of another arrival or a return. So Prospect 4. As most people know, Prospect was started post-Katrina as a way to bring tourism to the city through arts and culture. So this 4th iteration, we had 73 artists and arts collectives invited to participate for a total of 91 artists. So again, this idea of mapping, creating a cartography, how are people going to explore the city? And so the map on the left here is all of the sites that were official partners, and the map on the right. But the map on the right is one artist project. So it's Donald Odita created a project called Indivisible and Invincible, Monument to Black Liberation and Celebration in the City of New Orleans. For this project, Odili wanted to identify specific historical sites and call them out with a map, not a map, with a flag, almost like in this vein of exploration. You know, the flag marks the spot and marks the moment. So you'll see in the map on the left, there are sites like the New Orleans Museum of Art, La Musée, and on the right, there's Congo Square, Jackson Square, Dillard University, which is a historically black college and university. We have Doogie Chase Restaurant, the Dewdrop Inn, all of these really important canonical sites that were, with this development of kind of new cartographies, these important historic sites are kind of vanishing. And so there's this dual thing that his work was doing. And so here, there's a really funny image of me in the center. It's not the best, but so the image on the right, we basically installed 19 flags across various sites in the city, and the image on the left is of one of our prep team members installing the flag at Doogie Chase, which is a famous restaurant opened by Miss Leah Chase, who grew up in the 7th Ward neighborhood that I was living in. And the image in the center was extremely important to me. So it's William J. Friends Elementary School, and we hoisted the flag on November 14th, 2017, which was 57 years to the day that Ruby Bridges first integrated the school. Again, these moments of kind of remarkable coincidence, and I don't believe in coincidence, but these ideas of repetition and arrival and return just kept emerging. On the right, our preparator is hoisting the flag at the Dewdrop Inn, which is, if you've ever heard of the, Little Richard has a song called Welcome to the Dewdrop Inn, which was recorded there. It was the place to see and be seen, to play, and, you know, to just kind of vibe out for basically jazz and blues in New Orleans. It's right across from the Magnolia Projects. In its heyday, they had a barbershop in there. So it was a full service experience. You can get your hair done, get ready for your evening. There was a hotel. Yeah. It was very cool. And so this final slide is just a project that is upcoming. This is my first public sculpture exhibition at Crystal Bridges. And so the image on the right is a rendering of 13 flags. I'll be working with Odili again, although in this capacity as full curator. My role with Prospect, I was supporting another curator's vision, which was an incredible opportunity. But so Odili created this project in response to the southern border and the displacement of families that were crossing the border, and all of the immigration issues that our country is facing under the Trump administration. And so really kind of using the framework of color theory to kind of talk about how complementary colors, or colors that exist opposite one another, can be actually can be seen in unison, and how complementary colors might be representative of different nations or people. And 13 is meant to reference the original 13 colonies. So I think I'll pass it along to you now.
My turn?
Yeah.
I'll read it. And so to pick up, I'm going to talk about a couple of exhibitions. Like Allison, I've moved around quite a bit, but I'm born and raised in the South. I was born in Jackson, Mississippi, not too far from here. And for a while, I've lived in St. Louis, Missouri, which is I think it's my second home, I like to call it. I also have family there and in Chicago. But I lived there in 2014, working at the St. Louis Art Museum, where I co-curated an exhibition titled Anything But Civil, Kara Walker's Vision of the Old South. So I'll start kind of to get into it. I like to think, well, some say that curating is a protest against forgetting. And so be that as it may, I can sort of speak from experience that remembering is critical. For instance, I had a lot to remember for today's presentation, and I'm a little nervous because I had to remember a lot. I went back through the archive to get some stuff, but at any rate, it's also connected to history and cultural memory and mapping, something that Allison talked about. So again, I'll quickly discuss these exhibitions and sort of look at them as case studies for curating contemporary art in the South. And starting with thinking about the South, I think the Civil War is something that's incredibly important to think about our history and Southern history. So in 1866, 1 year after the Civil War ends and Reconstruction begins, Harper's Magazine published this 2-volume anthology titled Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War. And I spent a great deal of time combing through this text while conducting research for the exhibition. And here we can see the cover and an image of a page from the anthology. But here, again, the exhibition titled Anything But Civil, Kara Walker's Vision of the Old South. These are installation shots from the show. It opened in February 2014 at the St. Louis Art Museum. So the original Harper's illustrations consisted mostly of like battle scenes, fortifications, demolished cityscapes, and marching troops. But really what stood out to me when I was looking through it, what I became curious about, and something that Kara Walker really considers in this portfolio, is the lack of any depictions of enslaved people or the colored troops, which we know were part and parcel to the Civil War, but often less talked about. And so also, since the Civil War was really a war about the perpetuation of slavery, or rather the slave economy or land ownership, so the big question was, like, where were the black people, where were the native people in this depiction, this historical depiction of the Civil War? So this was also a question, again, that Kara Walker investigates in this portfolio from 2005, titled Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War, annotated. And the annotated is important because she's really making notes, so she's making her own sort of notes onto the, or annotating the actual historical documents. So it's a total set of 15 lithographs that actually borrow from the pages of the 19th century anthology. Each one is enlarged and superimposed with her iconic silhouettes. So again, we can see here in the image to the left that she's intentionally framing the black figures to bring our attention to their present and placement in history. So these are just 3 examples. And here in the one on the bottom, right, you can see there, I don't know if it's blurry, but you can see an actual, like, a child being lifted up in celebration. This was one of my favorites. But also a head inside of a head, like a male and female, sort of one and the same. So, and you can't really tell the sort of the racial identity also of the figure of the silhouette of on the right, on the bottom right. So this one always was really interesting to me, as well as the one on the top, where going back to the idea of the Civil War and as it relates to land and economy, this is cotton hordes. They're moving or smuggling cotton in and out of the South at this time. And so here's this like monstrous figure on the right, like blending in with the landscape. But these in the boat, I don't know if you can tell, but there is a black like and a white person like there in the boat, or like there may be three of them. So at any rate, these were the whole portfolio was a really fascinating set to look at, and then also looking at them in juxtaposition with the actual historical text. So, but the exhibition did include her drawings here. And the title of this set of drawings was No Dreams Are Good Dreams. And so it was important for us to include these because they kind of provided a preview of what like Kara Walker's mind was conjuring before they would come to life in the silhouettes. And often people kind of talk about Kara as this like demented, and she even says herself, like she has a lot going on in her head. And the South was important to her too. She grew up in Atlanta. She was from California and grew up in Atlanta. And when she talks about her experience growing up in the South, she says often that this is where she became or realized that she was black. She really started to understand her own racial and gender identity. So at any rate, these were intimate drawings, and they were important for us to include, and they were in the introductory gallery before you went into the space with the portfolio. And also, we did include 2 films. And these were also important because, again, they really animate everything. So they take her drawings, her silhouettes, her imagination, and sort of bring it all together. And so these 2 were really great. We ended up not including them inside of the gallery because they did have explicit content, but we did want to have them in conversation with the other works. But it ended up being a film-like series, a program that we developed to not only screen the films, but to then talk about them, right? So again, against the backdrop of Missouri's complicated history with slavery and emancipation, you think about Dred Scott, the Dred Scott case was there. This exhibit really became an exemplary space for discussing racial trauma and uncomfortable truths, as well as sort of viewing them in dialogue with historical works, viewing contemporary art in dialogue with historical works. And I'll note here, so having like worked primarily in art museums, in fellowship positions, I would say too, because this was a part of the Romare Bearden Fellowship in my year at the St. Louis Art Museum. But so it's important that I myself, as a part of my curatorial practice, remind myself that works of art, like people, are not bound to any particular historical or geographical narrative. And so there's always multiple perspectives to consider and multiple points of entry. So in curating, for me, the most challenging is to decide which way to go. And that's like also in life, like where do I go? But again, going back to the museum, the context, the gallery, it usually helps me to start with 2 main questions. And so I think about A, how will an exhibition connect with visitors? And then B, how will visitors connect with an exhibition? And so the answers to these questions are inevitably speculative and multiple. However, I like to keep this thread of inquiry at the forefront because it helps me to stay grounded in and adapt also to different locations, geographies, languages, people. Also to keep in mind that everyone brings their own experience, their own understandings to any exhibition, to any work of art. So then as curators, and this is a question I know you don't, like, how do we present this? You know, how do we present nuance and complexity and allowing works of art to be more than one thing with care and with intention? And I like to think also that that's what it means to be Southern, like a Southern person. Yeah, so that's...
Recap that. So say that as,
Say
set that
again?
metaphor up for us in a way that's...
Okay.
I like
Yes.
it.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay. So here, the next exhibition that I worked on was here in Memphis, and it's still up now at the Memphis Brooks Museum of Art. So if you haven't seen it already, please go. But it was essentially a one-object exhibition that moved around the museum. But to think about this in relation to the South, Terry Atkins was an artist who identifies as Southern. He was born in Virginia and grew up in D.C. His art intentionally deals with these ideas of nuance and complexity. And he draws directly from history in many ways. And so working with this one object, but thinking about his practice broadly as a conceptual artist, and these works really signal not only to the curator, but I think also to the audience to think broadly and critically about the works of art. Like, what do they mean? What are they doing? How do I feel about this? So, so this, again, the title of it was Renditions. And I don't know if you could see. So the title of it was Renditions 1 through 3. The first rendition, which is, you can see in the slide here, the installation shot from the Brooks, was about music and abstraction. So the piece was essentially a tribute to Charlie Parker. And it's a sound-based kinetic sculpture, and so it actually sporadically makes sound at different intervals. So it surprises visitors often, but which was really cool and part of the idea and the concept. The second rendition, which is still on view, is about storytelling and history. And so we have that. I don't have installation shots of that one, but it's in dialogue with 2 of his films. And the third rendition is about iconography and transcendence. So I guess to close, and then we can get into the conversation, what these exhibits have in common was that, yeah, they're both in the South, but they were also sort of new in a way for each respective institution, because for for the St. Louis Art Museum, Anything But Civil was like the first exhibit to bring programming and discussions about race into the conversation. And I think too it's important to note, because this exhibit was in 2014, it ended August 10th, and Ferguson happened on August 9th. That was when Mike Brown was shot and killed on August 9th. And so there was a sort of attention building. So in St. Louis, but we could talk about that more later. So, and then going back to the Brooks, Renditions was a sort of a way, it was an experimental exhibition again, but it was a way to sort of bring in these unexpected juxtapositions in the gallery. It was a way to experiment with one work of art, but to also sort of think about the collections. So, yeah. That's all, and we can start the conversation, yeah.
So my first question for you was about your projects in Memphis, but I actually, after listening to you speak about your projects, I feel like you've already brought us there, but you said something really poignant, and I'd love for you to set up that metaphor again of how artworks, what artworks do in the South and how that is inherently Southern. You were mentioning that, and I asked you to set it up, but I know you are continuing on in the talk, so I'd love if you could come back to that and set that up for us in a way that's as dynamic as it sounds really to my ears.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So the way I think about it, I don't know, so that idea sort of comes naturally, and again, it's and also very personal in a way, because again, I'm from Mississippi, and I think about myself, my Southern roots, my heritage in many ways when I bring myself to this work. But I made a note here from one of my favorite authors, and I don't know if you guys heard of Kiese Lehman.
I don't know this
He's also from Jackson, Mississippi.
Okay.
Awesome brother, and he talks about this being Southern and Southern art and literature, I think, or operating at lower frequencies, or Southern folks operating at lower frequencies, right? And this was also something that really crystallized for me too when I was thinking about Terry Atkins and the sound, and then living here in Memphis, in a city that's very much about music, and it's and so operating at these lower frequencies, I think it brings idea about like proximities. How can you hear? What are the subtleties? Attention to language and gestures, small gestures.
It's not just what you say, it's how you say it.
Thank you. Yes, it's how you say it.
It means so much.
Yes, and little gestures, hand movements. I talk with my hands. I'm a very like that kind of person. So at any rate, but attention to these gestures, body language, it helps us understand people. But I think it also connects in how I think about that in exhibition making. I think about that as a curator. How do these things feel together? And I don't know, can we say art has feelings? I don't know.
Or what is the body language, right? Or like,
yeah.
So it's almost like you have this kind of, for me, the metaphor you're setting up is like this exhibition is like a body, right?
Exactly.
And so what are some of these what are these moments of the exhibition that appeal to your different senses and also appeal to this embodied experience you're going to have? So what points to inflection?
Absolutely.
What points to hand gestures?
Absolutely.
What points to the way you said it?
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And two, also, what points to the person experiencing it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Experiencing the work of art. How do people move through the space? And I think that this is something that you were also considering in New Orleans. How people move through the city. How do people experience these things? We think, so it's about that.
Yeah, in New Orleans, it's interesting. So I lived in Chicago for 10 years before moving there, and I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. And, I had a car. I owned a car since I was 16 because Motor City is what you do.
Yeah.
And when I moved to Chicago, I sold my car about a year in and felt all this freedom having public transportation. And so when I moved to New Orleans, I didn't get a car for many reasons. Partially, I was responsible for getting to know the city. And I felt I actually didn't have to move to the city until 8 months after I actually arrived. But I felt that was very irresponsible to just drop down. I mean, more than I was already just dropping down into a community and kind of just like putting the pieces together for an exhibition. So I was like, no, I'm going to move down in October. I had a little Schwinn cruiser that I still have, and I rode the bus, I walked, I rode my bike everywhere. People thought I was crazy, which is fine because I also got to know the city really well. And then people were like, oh, I had colleagues that were like, girl, people don't ride bikes here. Or they made fun of me and said it was a particular type of people rode bikes in New Orleans. And I'm just going to leave it at that. And these same people now ride bikes in New Orleans. So, just going to say. And I tease them about not riding bikes. But, getting to know the city was really important, understanding the landscape, having an embodied experience. I'm very much interested in site specificity. A lot of the exhibitions that I've done have been multi-sited. I opened a show in Chicago called Out of Easy Reach. That was essentially like it was impossible for you to see all of the venues in the same day because they were in different parts of the city. And that was in response to, like redlining, the hierarchies of site and place in a city like Chicago, which has a South Side. And, tying into this question about the Global South, we've been talking about a lot in preparations for this and something I've been thinking about. So comment and then question for you. So, as you know, Prospect 4 artist Maria Magdalena Campos Pons. She's a Cuban-American artist, and for this upcoming iteration of the Havana Biennale, she has fractured the site of the Biennale and has it existing in 2 locations. So it'll be in Havana and also in Matanzas. And Matanzas is a port city that is actually closer to the United States than Havana, and it's the Afro-Cuban part of the island. It's actually the place that it's also actually the place that a lot of what they call them criollos, but Creole, a lot of the sugar plantation owners fled to during the Haitian move for independence, which was about maybe 18 years, I think. The entire, I think it was 1791, no, 12 years. I have to check that date. Anyhow, so she's really shifted the perspective and fractured this kind of like dimensional thing. And then she's invited people to speak, and I'm going to be speaking about my relationship to the Global South, and so using the framework of the Louisiana Purchase because it fits so nicely into her larger framework. And you also have worked a bit in the Global South, in particularly in South Africa.
South Africa.
And can you talk a bit about your experiences there and how they've informed what you do here?
Yeah. I moved straight here from South Africa, Cape Town, like another port city as well. Connections to slavery, slave trade, all of that. So the notes I made here, just to quickly, because that's a big question, but to try to summarize it, I guess the racial inequalities and economic disparities were evident in both geographies, right? That's here in the South as well as in South Africa and Cape Town. But also, I guess the common traits that exist are the migration. You think about migration and displacement of indigenous peoples. And this is also like in areas in cities like New Orleans, right? And the Mississippi Delta and the Gulf Coast.
Right, but what would be really great is to hear about what you did in South Africa.
Oh, the exhibition.
Yes.
So all things being equal, and it was funny. So the exhibition, the Zeiss Museum of Contemporary Art Africa was a museum that represented artists of African descent from all over the world, contemporary art in particular. The title piece, or the title of the exhibition, was borrowed from Hank Willis Thomas, a piece that was called All Things Being Equal. It was literally like a text-based piece that had this beautiful reflective surface. And I loved giving tours and talking about and starting with this piece. One, because of course people knew my accent. You could tell automatically that I wasn't from South Africa. And then two, because I was from the South. I had a Southern accent as well. And so, again, I loved talking about or starting with this piece, because it opened up an opportunity for me to talk to people in a different country in a different way, sort of starting with this idea of equality and looking at this work of art that had this reflective surface, that had this, a certain meaning.
You could see yourself in it.
Yeah, you could see yourself in it, exactly.
Yeah.
And so that was the idea. And so we would all together kind of start off and look at each other. I would turn my back and actually look at this work of art with them before we began the tour, or talking about other works in the collection. So that experience. And we worked inside of the gallery, so we were actually very physically there. So I got a chance to know the people. We had, it was a very close knit and quickly put together. Quickly put together. That's the wrong way to say it, but we were
tightly put together.
Museum. It was tightly put together, but it was a brand new museum. I literally moved there a week before it opened, or 2 weeks before it opened, and so it was really had that energy. So.
There's something else that you mentioned, and if I'm cutting you off,
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
Seeing yourself within the work is a theme in your work, in your curatorial practice.
It is. Yeah, I do look for that, but also I look for, many things. I look for other people. I look for that sensibility, or the sensibility, the human sensibility, I think, is something that I do think about. And I think, too, that's the care and intention that I was saying earlier about as a curator, and then as well as being Southern. Southern hospitality is real. We care. If you sneeze, if we say bless you, we mean it. Or bless your heart.
Oh, that's different, though.
Bless your heart. I know, but
don't
it means
tell me
something.
To bless. Don't bless my heart. That means something else.
But it means something.
That is shade. That is pure shade.
No,
bless their heart.
Bless your heart. So at any rate,
that is pure shade.
It depends. Anywho. But that's true. That's true. Yeah. So I have a question for you.
Okay.
I want to go into also to think more about, again, the connections between American South, Global South, some of the points as it relates to the land ecology, and this common cultural hybridity, right? The cultural hybridity as it relates to Creole, culture. Hybridity that we can see in the food, music, dance, even architecture, spirituality. So, and this is something that I think Prospect brings together so beautifully. or helps like kind of bring sight to that. So, but it's also it was the first biennial, triennial that also spread throughout the city that brings us together. And it's not, again, limited to art institutions. So with all of this cultural hybridity and culture and like everything, what makes, and then also to think about maybe after Hurricane Katrina too, how it was started, if we want to bring that into it. But what makes New Orleans a great location for such an event like Prospect? And then what benefit does it have for the city? Yeah, for New Orleans.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
To your point, the Prospect is the first U.S. biennial to actually be in the traditional biennial format, which is multi-sided. There's other biennials like the Whitney and the Hammer that are locked into one institution and kind of rely more on the continuity every 2 years, so that's how they call themselves a biennial. Prospect is now a triennial. That was one of the first shifts that were made, and it's an opportunity to give more time to plan. But so every 3 years it happens, and Prospect 5 is underway now, and it's I'm very excited about the co-curators, and it's going to be incredible. But I think New Orleans is the perfect site for kind of this unison or this idea of hybridity, because it's a hybrid site. And that's, it's a site that was French before it was American. It was France before it was the United States, it was France, and then it was Spain, and then it was France again, and then it was US. But it's still not American at all. I think that, some early questions I had working on Odili's project when I was trying to think about flag sites that already existed and places we could hoist a flag. I asked questions about the American flag that were, I received chuckles from my colleagues because they were like, flag code, like American flag, like this is New Orleans, like really helping for me to understand the framework in which that city operates. It's very much an Afro-Caribbean city, first and foremost, before anything else. And so it constantly required for me to reorient myself, not only myself in relationship to the landscape, and because of the way the Mississippi flows through the Crescent City, I had to reorient my understanding of North and South. I was coming from Chicago, which is a city that's based on a grid. So if you're at State and Madison, you're at 0, and if you go 20 blocks south, you're at 2000 South, 0 east-west, right? It's very easy to position yourself. In New Orleans, no. I found constantly, shifting. In different ways? People don't say north and south; they say lakeside of Claiborne, or riverside of this. So your position. Oh, it's time for us to wrap it up. Okay. So your position is actually in relationship to the water, as opposed to kind of other more traditional ways to orient yourself. And one of the things I did was I really slowed down and listened. And that was, again, like, I'd have conversations with Mr. Birch, and we'd sit in my living room and talk about the books I had in my library, and he was there in those moments. He'd be like, oh yeah, that was the photographer for this David Hammond's piece, and I'd ask questions. He'd be like, slow down, baby, slow down. Like, just slow down. And that was something that I learned to do. So I think I became more familiar with the city the less I tried to make sense of it. And the more I just listened and watched and learned and took my time and kind of tuned into that lower frequency that is very much a part of my ancestry, because I have Southern roots. And the more I was able to kind of tune into that lower frequency that Kim so eloquently set up for us as a kind of a vibrant way to think about the sonic landscape of the South, the more I was able to kind of tune in to exactly what was happening. Thank you all. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, Allison.